criminal investigations would search for fingerprints, what other ways would they turn to identify a criminal?
The question was, in what other ways would investigators try and identify a criminal? So fingerprinting technology is actually pretty old as far as technologies go. Other things like blood testing and DNA, those are they're very young. So fingerprinting was pretty early. So I would assume that they used witness accounts and things like that. Also just matching hair samples, and yeah, that's most likely what they did.
Question. So I know like a lot of people, especially in the winter, get very dry hands and cracks in their fingers. How does that, do you know how that affects the fingerprinting process? Because like they can, sometimes I feel like sometimes cracks can come and go. Maybe I'm wrong on, maybe they do all stay, the cracks, but.
The question was, in the winter people get dry hands, and I believe your question is, how does skin moisture affect fingerprints? Well, skin moisture obviously affects fingerprints in how they can be seen and how clear they are, but there will always be a slight amount of oil on your hands, no matter how dry and cracked it may seem. So sure, it might be a little bit easier to get fingerprints off very moisturized hands, but it doesn't mean that it's impossible to get fingerprints off of dry hands.
Going on the other side, would any instances of moisture being added onto the fingerprints, such as a rainfall or any body of water, hinder the process?
The question was, does excess moisture hinder fingerprints? Well, lipids are generally classified as hydrophobic substances, meaning they repel water. So yes, a rainfall might wash away fingerprints, and it would definitely make it a lot harder if the substance was wet, especially in dusting. But the fingerprint, I believe, would still remain intact, because lipids generally tend to avoid water. You've all seen oily pans, water goes right off.
Andy? You're up here, you can get a question.
I mean, sure, up at the judge's table. Do you have a question for Ishaan?
Not.
Alright, that's fair.
Andrew?
Andrew, ask a question, please.
And Kimya.
You mentioned several methods for discovering fingerprints, like dusting. Do you know when those methods were discovered and how?
The question was, do I know how and when those methods were discovered? I know dusting was the earliest method, and things like fuming both iodine and cyanoacrylate came later, and then the most recent is ninhydrin because it's the most chemically complex, as well as cyanoacrylate obviously coming along with superglue, and then people realizing you can burn it for fingerprints. So powders were first, then fuming, and then ninhydrin, but I don't know exact dates or exact methods of discovery. Olivia?
Yes. Do you know if there is a minimum amount of fingerprint, because you might get a partial fingerprint, that they need to get before they can confirm that these things are a match?
The question was, is there a minimum fingerprint because you can get partial fingerprints? So what I talked about with the minutiae, or minutia, is these patterns can be found all over the finger, not just in the main core of the pattern. So as long as you have that 10 minutia minimum, and you can match those between the partial fingerprint and the suspect's taken fingerprint, that would confirm a match.
How identical is the fingerprints for families? Are there any similar patterns or not?
The question was, how similar are fingerprints between family members? Fingerprints come from when the fetus touches parts of the womb and this causes the outermost layer of the skin, called the epidermis, to buckle and fold. This process is slightly hereditary, but it's mostly up to the fetus itself, so it's not genetic. So there are some very slight hereditary characteristics that you might see, but each fingerprint's going to be pretty much unique.
Has everyone asked questions?
So.
If there are no further questions,
If there are no further questions, this concludes my visual presentation.